Hello everyone, bringing you a video today looking at a pair of Canadian Mark III combat boots. Now this sort of continues the Canadian theme on the channel from the Mannequin of the Month. Not really intentional, it just happens that the Canadian C2 Gunner idea topped the poll for the Mannequin of the Month, so we've ended up with a bit of a Canadian flavour to start September, which is no bad thing. These are an excellent pair of combat boots. We've looked at a previous example, a previous mark of these on the channel before, and they are really very good design. The initial design of these boots was introduced in the 1960s and they were progressively developed, and then the Mark III saw service basically through the end of the Cold War. And they are a very good pair of high leg combat boots. So we're going to have a look at these in some detail now. So here they are. Those who've watched the video looking at the Mark II Canadian combat boots will already see these are very similar. Indeed, the uppers are essentially identical. These are a fairly well worn pair of boots, as you can probably see. They're nice and soft, nice to wear. As we'll see in a minute, the tread is well worn away, but they are my size, so that's quite nice to have. And as I say, much as they are quite heavily worn, they're very comfortable to wear, and there's plenty of life left in them as well. So you can see details of the uppers here. Some similarities with the Canadian GP boots, as mentioned in recent videos. This seam across here is basically the construction of the uppers, with the seam across the top here is basically consistent between the two. You do have a very differently shaped backstay though on the Canadian boots, with this bulge just above the heel here, as you can see. If I move the other one out of the way, we look at that, you can see there this curve profile to the backstay on the boot. Very nice, very good quality of manufacture, lovely soft leather. You can see it is pebble grey, and that's very evident on the tongue here, as you can see. A reinforcement piece around the top here, around the cuff, and you can see the markings inside the boot here. I'll hold this up to the camera. I believe this is a stores code of some description. Anyone who could clarify on that, I'd be very interested to know. And then also on the other one here, as you can see in there, I believe 11 is the size. That does correspond to the size which is on the sole of the boots. You can see the eyelets running up there, and we have this notch here, which of course allows more flexibility in the boot. That's the idea of that notch cut between the upper and the lower set of eyelets there. It does allow the foot to flex forward a little bit more without the leather bunching up as much. Or at least that's the idea behind that element of the design. We look at the sole here. You can see the prolific manufacturer of these, Greb, very common manufacturer of the Canadian combat boots. Marked on the sole there, and then we have both Mondo Point NATO sizing on the left here, and then the imperial sizing, I guess you could say. I believe Canada, if I remember correctly, uses either US or UK shoe sizing. I think US, so I required an 11 because I'm roughly a UK 10 or 11 depending on the shoe, and generally speaking I can get away with a 10, so that would be equivalent. I think it is US sizing, so an 11 would be a UK 10. So you can see here the tread will be very, very familiar to anyone who's familiar with British boots combat high. The tread is in fact identical. The Canadians were certainly using it first, so I would imagine that this was carried across to the boots combat high from the Canadian boots. There was possibly some discussion there, and that led to the British boots using exactly the same tread pattern as this. These are the Mark III, as I say, and the Mark II differs primarily in having a less defined tread pattern on the sole. So they didn't give us as much grip, basically. So that was one improvement, was the changeover to this sole from the Mark II to the Mark III. And prior to that, I think the only difference between the Mark II and the Mark I is the lack of this notch in the front here on each side to allow the boot to flex forward more easily. That's my understanding of the mark progression with these. My understanding again with dates is that the Mark III did appear in the early 1970s, if not the late 1960s, so it appeared fairly early on in the life of the combat boots, and then it was standard through basically the end of the Cold War. It of course has been replaced now, but a very decent design of boot. It's not surprising they were in use for a long time. I've heard from those I've spoken to who used these, I've only heard good things. As I say, I'd be interested to hear from anyone who wore these, any problems which arose, any points that you found negative about them, or anyone again who wished to sing their virtues. As I say, they seem to me to be a very decent pair of combat boots for the time they were in service. So there we are, the Canadian Mark III combat boot. So there we are. I hope you found it interesting looking at these. I have to say they are a very good pair of combat boots. Looking at the overall design, the people's recollections of wearing them and using them, they were well liked. And certainly these boots were also very popular with British servicemen serving at Bartus, the British Army's training unit at Suffield in Canada. They were very popular with British servicemen who could get their hands on them, which is no surprise given the footwear the British Army were issuing at the time. So hopefully you found it interesting looking at these, as I always say. If you have and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below, and as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It's greatly appreciated, as I always say. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.